She moves into it, and there it goes. It's high enough, it's long enough, it's a beauty. It's straight between the posts. The score hit out.
Hello and welcome to That's the Way It Was, a program that looks back at the history of rugby league. In episode 19, thin, balding, awkward, ungainly, a chain smoker who would use sticky tape to put padding on his elbows and knees. These are some of the adjectives and phrases used to describe a man who will remain on the history books of rugby league for eternity. To discuss the life and career of Brian Bevan, we're going to speak to Neil Ormston, who's the organiser of the Rugby League Record Keepers Club. So Neil, welcome to That's the Way It Was.
Thanks, Rob. Good to be here. I was slightly worried where that introduction was going and thought you were going to refer to me at some point along the way there. But yeah, certainly Mr. Bevin, who we're going to spend some time talking about today, was not the archetypal rugby player, but certainly one which has left a huge impact on the game in this country, in England, where I'm based. So yeah, happy to spend some time talking to you about him today.
All right, Neil. Brian Bevan, he was born on the 24th of June 1924 at Waverley in Sydney. What can you tell us about his childhood?
I think a lot of the information we've kind of got it's important to give this a shout out very early doors, I think. Robert Gate in the UK did a fantastic biography on Brian, and there's a lot of good information about Brian's early days in there. So he went to junior school up in Bondi. Went to, I believe it was Randwick Boys Intermediate High there, and had a lot of showed some early athletic prowess, I think. There's a quote from his daughter, I think, about him being born with a rugby ball under his arm. His father played for Eastern Newtown before him, so he was from good rugby stock, and I think was introduced to the game by his father, playing in some of the local junior teams in the area where he was brought up.
Yes, because I was talking with you about this just prior to the interview there. He played for a junior rugby league club called Graham's. Now, I myself spent some time in the Eastern Suburbs juniors, and I'd never heard of this club, and I'd spoken to others, some of my old teammates there, about, well, who's this Graham's club? It turns out that Graham's was a bit of an interesting junior rugby league club itself.
Yeah, I believe so. I think the main information I've got from this is actually from what you were sharing, Rob. Maybe you can give the background of the slightly shady nature of the club, I think.
Well, it appears as though it was sort of a nightclub down there in Hunter Street in the city, and I think they probably didn't have that good of a public image, and they decided the best way to improve their public image was to start up a junior rugby league club, and the club was named Graham's after the nightclub itself. Yes, it was one of those places that sort of opened at 11 o'clock at night and closed at 11 o'clock in the morning. But one thing's for sure is that a lot of the Eastern Suburbs players at the time came from this club. Brian Bevan was just one of them, but a lot of the players from Graham's went on to represent Eastern Suburbs at the various levels. So, yes, it was a very interesting sort of club there. Neil, his career at Eastern Suburbs, his actual career starts in 1941. So what can you tell us about his career at East?
So I suppose breaking into the East team at the time, obviously the backdrop then is with the Second World War being underway, and Australia participating in that as well, one of the Allied countries, one of the countries of the British Empire at the time. So you've got quite, through the war, you've got quite a fluid set of players, I guess, because you've got players going off serving their country. You've got young guys like Brian coming through the ranks as they would do in normal times as well. So he first starts playing in the East team, as you said, kind of 1941-ish, moving through the grades. So there's three grades of teams, I think, at East at the time, who were kind of affiliated to them, and then they've got the reserve, the junior teams under that. So I think Brian starts off playing in the thirds and the reserves in that first season, and has a pretty unremarkable start, I think it's fair to say. He kind of flicked between the reserves and the third team in that first year, and he gets mixed press, I think it's fair to say. I mean, it should be remembered he's only 17-ish at this time. So he's a young guy breaking through, playing sometimes on wing, sometimes at centre, even has a game at 5/8. So he's moving around quite a bit within the team, I guess, trying to find his place, as you would expect for a young guy coming through. Does get some good write-ups, I think, from press reports at the time and comments from some of the coaching staff at East, and does start to run in some scores, certainly from the middle of the year onwards, where he's playing in the third team. He does start to run in some tries there, and the thirds actually do have a good run and make it all the way to the grand final in their competition, which they do win that season. So he has some early success, I think it's fair to say there.
All right, so 1942, he actually makes his first grade debut.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's, again, he's a very young guy making it into the first team then. It's not quite as common, I think, in the times past for guys to be making first team debuts as young as that. But I guess the circumstances at the time, with players being scattered around the globe, as what happens to Brian himself pretty soon after. He gets an early opportunity, I think, to make it into the East's first team. And I suppose maybe what's most remarkable of all, for what follows later in his career, he actually doesn't score a try in any of his first team games that he plays with East, which is, in normal circumstances, you would say is unremarkable, but because of what comes after for him, is probably the one thing which is most surprising from that time almost.
Yes, because he made his first grade debut against South there, but then it was only 2 days later, after his first grade debut, that he's called up to the Navy. He goes off to get mobilised for the Navy.
Yeah, exactly right. And he doesn't play at all any grade rugby in 1943, because he's off touring the globe as part of his naval duties. And that's the case for the next couple of years, really. He's not on land enough to play games. He does play a few games for East in the reserves and the thirds in 1944. But that's a time when he's serving in the Navy overseas, isn't able to play for his host club, and I guess something that a lot of players at that time experienced, a much greater battle and greater issues to be facing than the joys of playing rugby, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. Well, do you know anything about his naval career in itself? Like, do you know anything about where he served and so forth? What he was doing during his naval career?
I've not got lots of information to hand. Okay. I think he did his training up in. He certainly spent some time up in North Queensland, I think, when he was first kind of drafted onto his first ship up there, and I think spent some time patrolling around the coast up in Townsville and near Cairns. I think relatively uneventful times, really. Probably had what would be called a good war, if there was such a thing. But I think a couple of near misses with some Japanese dive bombers, I think a relatively unscathed period, which is obviously good to hear.
Yeah, well, so it's when he's on naval duty. He's on naval duty in 1945 that he goes to England. He goes to England on the cruiser Australia. The ship is being sent to England for basically repairs, I think, and a refit and so forth. His father gives him a letter to give to a fellow called Bill Shankland. Now, who is Bill Shankland?
Yeah, Bill Shankland is probably another legendary figure in Warrington. So he's regarded in some circles as one of the finest all-round sportsmen Australia has ever produced. He was in his youth, he was a noted swimmer, cricketer, boxer. He toured with the Australian Rugby Union team, and in his rugby league career, starting out at Glebe and then also moved on to Easts, and toured with the 1929 Kangaroos over to England.
Yeah.
He was actually top try scorer on that tour with 24 tries and played in all 4 tests. That was the famous 4-test year where the 3rd test was a 0-0 draw, so they decided to play another deciding game in the 4th test in that series. He played in all 4 of those games, did return to Australia afterwards, but then was signed by Warrington and returned back to England in 1931. And he actually stayed and played for England, played for Warrington for, I think it was 7 seasons. So he made over 200 appearances for Warrington and scored 74 tries for them. Was the first Australian captain at Wembley, leading Warrington in the Challenge Cup final in 1933, and that was something he repeated in 1936. He also captained Warrington in a couple of championship finals at that time as well, and won a couple of Lancashire Cups with Warrington. So he had a very well-established rugby league career before then the final chapter in his incredible sports journey. He became a professional golfer.
Right.
He actually finished 3rd in the British Open in 90. I think just before the war. I think the last British Open before the war, he finished 3rd, and I think in the first Open after the war, he finished 4th. So an accomplished golfer, and the tale is that when he was being introduced to who would have been the future King of England at for the 1933 Cup final, the King recognised Shankland and asked him how his golf was going, to which Shankland replied, "Very, very good, sir. How's yours?" So he was a noted golfer even in his rugby career, such that royalty in the UK knew of him. So an incredible all-round sportsman, and he was actually the golf professional at Temple Newsome Golf Club in Leeds. So I think given that Shankland played for Easts and Bevan's father played for Easts, I think there was obviously a connection there, and he would have been known. They would have been known to each other. So his father Eric, I think, did an introduction for Brian to Bill to try to get him a trial at an English club.
Yes.
I think there's a tale which has been disproven now about Leeds seeing Bevin and seeing his appearance and discounting him on that front. I think the reality is that there's a fair bit of myth in that tale. I think Leeds didn't even get to the point of running the rule over him and actually looking at him. They turned down the introduction from Bill Shankland, suggesting that Brian might be worth a trial. I think Hunslet did the same thing and passed up. So Hunslet, another club based in South Leeds. Right. But obviously with his Warrington connections, having played there so successfully for a number of years, Bill was actually able to get in touch with the Warrington club, maybe as a last resort, actually, to introduce Brian to the club and say, give this guy a chance, see if you can get him a run out in the reserves. To have a look over him, which is exactly then what happened.
Right. So when does his career, when does he actually start playing for Warrington?
So it's quite a fragmented start, because obviously he's still serving in the Navy at this time. So he's on leave. When I think he spent some time staying with Bill Shankland in Leeds, but actually travelled across to Warrington to make his debut for Warrington in the reserve team game in November of 1945. I think it's fair to say he made a really big impression in that first game. I think he set a try up with what would become a trademark shimmy and sidestep through to put another player through a gap, and I think scored in that game as well, if I remember rightly.
Yes.
So he did enough in that game to secure himself a spot as a trialist in the first team match against Oldham the following week. On the 17th of November, he made his debut for Warrington. He's actually listed in the programme there as AN Other, but he is named in the programme as Brian Bevan, and they reference his appearance in the reserve team the previous week. He doesn't score in that game, but he obviously does enough to catch the Warrington committee men's eye, because they give him a 3-year contract to join the club once he's demobilised from the Navy. So with his leave then ended, he returns back to his ship and sails back to Australia. At that point, leaves England only to return for the following season.
Yes, because in 1945 he actually only played the one match for Warrington before he returns to Australia, and he gets back to Australia. He starts playing with East again. He spends in 1946 season. He actually starts playing a few more games in the first with East, but it's in August 1946 or in March that he's demobilised. He's demobilised from the Navy in March 1946. He starts playing for East again, as I said there, and he leaves for England in August 1946. Takes a month to get to England, but in September, that's when he sort of starts playing. When did he score his first actual try then for Warrington?
You caught me on the back foot with that one.
All right.
With me. He does make, it's fair to say he makes a very strong impression straight from the off. He actually scores in his return game on the 14th of September. So he actually kicks goals as well during that first season. He kicks 34 goals as well as scoring 48 tries. But it's fair to say that his impact is significant from the off. The 48 tries that he scores there is actually at the time was Warrington's record in a season. That had been set just before the war. So straight away he's off breaking records for his club, and makes a huge impression on the team. Their performances improved significantly. They're starting to make some very astute signings, with players returning to action, coming off their various war services.
Yes.
So Warrington do start to make some very good signings. That season itself isn't entirely successful. They finish 5th, which is just outside of the playoffs, and make the semi-final of the Challenge Cup. So there's no success on the pitch in terms of silverware that year. But certainly for Brian, a personal triumph as he starts to settle down into the team, and by the early springtime, late winter, early springtime, he starts to go on the runs that you see him go on quite consistently through his career, where he's scoring hat-tricks in 3 consecutive matches, and the mantra of the Warrington team seemed to be at that time, get the ball to Bev. That was their main attacking threat, and it was recognised quite quickly what an exceptional talent they had, with his fantastic speed and his sidestepping abilities, and he would become obviously a very key part of the success that followed.
Yes, because at Warrington he did there's an incredible set of records that he established at the club. Can you just outline some of those records that he holds at Warrington?
Yeah, so I mean, his overall career record is for Warrington is 740 tries and 620 appearances, which are both by far and away the records of the club. I mean, the try records is over 500 better than the next best.
Neil?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, you just dropped out there. You were saying that
sorry.
his try record was 500 more than, because it only took him, the previous record holder for Warrington was a fellow called Jack Fish, I understand, but it didn't take him long to sort of pass Jack Fish's record for the highest try scorer for Warrington.
No, I think it was in his 5th season he surpassed that record, which, bearing in mind his Warrington career was to last for 16, you could see how far ahead he was going to end up.
Yeah.
And Jack Fish was actually recognised as one of the first great wingers in rugby league in this country. He was an England international at the time that the international game just first started, and regularly played in the county team for Lancashire. So he was, Warrington were a club who had that pedigree for having great wingers previously. So Brian was very much following in those footsteps. And I think at first it sounds like he had to win over some of the real old timers who were supporting the club, who in their eyes probably were never expecting to see anybody as good a winger as Jack Fish. But I think it's fair to say he won over even the most ardent of old timers with the performances that he eventually showed. His career record in the UK is just short of 800 tries. So he scored 796 tries, predominantly for Warrington, but also at the end of his career for Blackpool and in representative games, which we might come on to for other nationalities. But that career total is over 200 better than Billy Boston, who's in 2nd place in the all-time charts. So that puts it into some context, how far and above he was, his longevity, his individual season performances are up there with the very best. There's only Albert Rosenfeld in the UK who scored more tries in an individual season than Brian. In terms of topping try scoring charts, he's got records all over the place for that. So the combination of that longevity and the level of performance that he was able to bring out is obviously what then leads him to the exalted position he's in, so far ahead of everybody else.
But Neil, I think we should point out that this was a bit of a sort of golden period, I suppose, in Warrington's history. There were a lot of very good players in this Warrington team, as well as Brian Bevin, weren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. There's probably, Brian probably spans two teams, I would say, in Warrington's in the spell that he's at in Warrington, because when he first joins the team, there's some established English internationals which the club bring in. The front row, Bill Derbyshire, Jim Featherstone, Dave Cotton, are all widely regarded as some of the best players in their position in this country. He's got Albert Johnson, who's a Great Britain winger, on the other wing. Harold Palin's the captain. But that team was the first to win a championship for Warrington. In 1948, they went on and won the Challenge Cup in 1950. Only Bevan, Jerry Helm and Harry Bath, they're the only players who actually span the two teams, if you like, the two eras of Warrington's championship success, because between that kind of 1950, 51, 52 period, that initial team is broken up. There's a lot of players that retire and move on. And the team start to bring quite a lot of new blood through, bringing in some players through the ranks locally, but also signing some players from other clubs. And then when Warrington win their second and third championships in 1954 and 1955, the makeup of the team is quite different at that point. You've got players like the Norton brothers, Albert and Danny. You got Jim Challoner, who was Bev's centre, who played alongside him at centre more games than anybody else. He was a Britain international. you've got Bob Ryan, you've got Eric Fraser in there. So you've got a number of international players again there, but a different group than that first team that he was in. And Bevan, Helm and Bath are the three players who kind of span that era. They're the three who played in all three of Warrington's championship successes, and are really the kind of the star winger, the key halfback, and the dominant forward are the three players who that kind of success is built upon most, I would say.
All right, and Neil, some of the tries that he scored, that Brian Bevan scored, will have sort of gone down in history. In 1948, there was a match there against Wigan. Well, he scored what some people refer to as the waltzing Matilda try. Others have described it as one of the greatest rugby league tries ever scored. Can you sort of briefly tell us about this try?
Yeah, it's interesting in one respect in that this doesn't actually count in his official record. So the 740 tries for Warrington doesn't include this try because this is in what's deemed to be a pre-season friendly game. Not that there was much that was friendly about these matches ever between Warrington and Wigan, and I mean I think there were 20,000 plus people in attendance I think at the match, so they were full-blooded affairs, but as a non-official match it doesn't actually count in his official record. But by all accounts, you had newspapers publishing diagrams in the week following the match, showing the route that he took and the number of players that he beat, and the tail goals that he scored. He picked the ball up in his own in-goal area. He then beat 2 or 3 players inside the first 10 yards or so, and then starts to jink across the pitch and run something like 120 meters from one corner of the pitch to score in the diagonal opposite corner. At the other end, having beaten something like 6 or 7 of the Wigan players along the way. So I think that that's probably a good testament to the type of tries that he was quite renowned for. Long distance efforts using a combination of pace and the ability to beat a man, which is often what's cited, if you read reports. And sadly, it is a case that you need to read reports. There's very, very limited footage of Brian's career and his actual performances, because obviously it's in the era before television. So there are some snippets, and you can find some of that on YouTube if you Google it, which is definitely worth doing, because there is some fantastic images, but very, very limited, unfortunately.
Do you think Brian Bevan was a bit of a sort of a revolutionary or so when it comes to wingers? Because I mean, in those times, a winger would just get the ball and just head off straight down the sideline, touch line. But as you just described, Brian Bevan was sort of he was all over the place. He was zigzagging, popping up at different fields. Do you think he was a bit of a revolutionary when it came to wing play?
I think he was, by all accounts, extremely unorthodox in the way he played, and I think that was down to his own attributes. He was incredibly fast, and was able to kind of compete only on an amateur basis, but there were races run, and he was up there with the very fastest athletes in the country in England at the time. So he was blessed with exceptional pace and blessed with a fantastic sidestepping ability and that ability to beat a man. I guess he maybe didn't revolutionise the play in a traditional sense, because it was so hard for other players to replicate what he was doing. Because if you've not got exceptional pace and a fantastic sidestepping ability, you wouldn't be able to do what he was doing. And I think that's, you consistently see when people talk about opposing wingers who talk about their most difficult opponent to play with at the time, they would often cite Bevan because of that unorthodox nature and because he could do things that others couldn't. So it wasn't the case that he set a template for other players to then copy themselves, because quite simply they weren't able to copy it. And I think that's probably what gave him the advantage and set him up for the try scoring records that he got, because he was to a large degree unique.
Yes, and another very memorable try that he scored came in the Challenge Cup in 1954 against Oldham. Neil.
Yeah.
The try against Oldham in the 1954 Challenge Cup, that was a very memorable try, and a very important try as well, because they were able to defeat Oldham, and of course they went on to play in that very famous 1954 Challenge Cup final win.
Yeah, that's true, and I think that not just the type of tries, the volume of tries that Brian scored, but the importance of some of those tries stands out quite consistently as well. So you referenced the Oldham try there in the Challenge Cup, that it being a knockout competition, obviously having a match winner of Brian's capabilities is vital, I guess, to help you through some of those tight ties. The 1959 Lancashire Cup final, he scored what was the winning try in that match as well. So he consistently scored in the big games and consistently saw Warrington through what were often quite tight encounters. The game was much lower scoring, obviously, at the time.
Yeah.
And the difference a try could make was often quite important. The difference between winning and losing, and you've cited one, and I've mentioned another couple there of instances where he proved the match-winning difference between the team, which probably again just even further cements that legendary status at Warrington.
And in Neil, 1954 is also a very important year, because it's during the 1953-54 season he actually becomes the game's highest ever try scorer, when he passed Alf Ellenby's record of 446 tries. Ellenby was a winger who played for St Helens of Wigan in the 1920s and 30s there, but it was during that season that he actually, does become Rugby League's highest ever try scorer there, when he passed Alf Ellenby. I understand it was a match against Bramley.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is that the contemporary reporting of when certain career records are broken maybe differs to what we would kind of recognise now. So we might come on to talk about the Record Keepers Club, whose work I'm leading at the moment, at the end, but there was an absence of real official records, if you like, at the time, in terms of defining which games were included in scoring records and the like. So you see elements of confusion actually as to where, what totals players have scored over the careers. So that Walton Matilda try we referred to earlier, some people in contemporary reporting would include that kind of try. Those pre-season friendly games would be included. So it's not always entirely clear when those particular records are broken, but you're right. It was certainly around about that time that Bev overtook Ellaby, which, when you think, that's 1954, he carried on playing for Warrington for another 8 seasons after that, and then had a couple of years at Blackpool at the end as well. So he's got another decade of being able to extend his lead at the top of that chart at that point.
Yes, because that was another thing that, apparently in this match, this was another Challenge Cup match against Bramley. He scored 6 tries in this match. This is when he passed supposedly passed Alf Ellenby's record. But because is it true that he scored a hat-trick or more of tries on 100 occasions, they say?
Yes, yeah, and that's I mentioned Robert Gates' work before. That's something that's been kind of verified and confirmed through the great work that Robert and other statisticians have done. So yeah, 100 hat tricks is what he managed to land in the end, and I think that's just 3 or more in a game. So I guess he scored 2 hat tricks in that match against Bramley, but I think that only counts as 1 in the way that's been counted.
Okay, yeah. And he finished off his career at Warrington. He scored a try in his final match.
He did, yes. A game against Lee over the Easter period was his final game in 1962, and I think quite emotional scenes at the end. People recognising, sometimes with players you don't recognise their achievements maybe quite so much until after they've really finished and hung their boots up. I think Brian's one of those players who it was quite clear to everybody at the time what his status was, both for Warrington and in the sport. So yeah, a very emotional occasion. I think the crowd were singing Waltzing Matilda after the match, and he was given a standing ovation and kind of cheered from the pitch by the players who carried him off after the end of that game. But quite fitting, I suppose, that he managed to score on his final appearance in Warrington colours.
And Neil, just when you thought his career had probably finished, in June 1962, he becomes the coach of Blackpool, who were in the they were in the English second division at this stage. What happened at Blackpool Borough?
Yeah, so it was a time of change coming in the sport in this country. So two divisions were actually first reintroduced in that 1962-63 season. And Blackpool, as you say, were in the second half of the league, so therefore joined the second division. And I think Brian, obviously having played under some great coaches at Warrington and had such a successful career, saw that as something which would allow him to keep his interest in the game going and allow him to kind of pass some of that knowledge on to other players. And that was the intention when he moved to Blackpool, is he would take up something of a coaching role. But
yep.
It's not entirely clear, I don't think, but for some reason that didn't happen. So he was announced to be moving there in a coaching capacity, but he ends up actually playing again, somewhat sporadically, because he's well into his late 30s. He's 37-ish at this point. So he doesn't seem to do much coaching, but he does do a bit of playing, and does continue to run in some tries. He actually plays on and off throughout the season for the next couple of years at Blackpool, and continues to kind of contribute in that capacity at least.
And Neil, we know when he scored his first try. Do we know when he scored his last try?
His final try in first class games, anyway, for in official matches, was against Doncaster on the 7th of December in 1964. So some 18 years or so after he scored his first in the English game, he scores his final try there for Blackpool. He does play a few more games after that, and it's February the following season against Oldham, actually, the team that he made his debut against in England. That's his last appearance for Blackpool, when I think time had finally caught up with him at the grand old age of 38 or so. Then I think he will have recognised by that point it was time to hang his boots up.
All right, but Neil, okay, we know that Brian Bevin had a career at East and Warrington and Blackpool, but he also played for a team called Other Nationalities. So can you just explain who the Other Nationalities were?
Yeah, they're an all-star team, I guess, of their day, before the phrase was probably coined in the way that it is for modern marketing purposes. So at different points in time, there have been transfer bans between from English teams signing Australian players, and the other way around. But typically, it was to protect the Australian league and the integrity of that, and the integrity of the Australian Test team. But that ban was lifted shortly after hostilities ended in the Second World War, which allowed players like Warrington to sign Brian Bevan and Harry Bath, and Huddersfield signed a number of renowned Australians at the time. So Lionel Cooper, Pat Devery, Johnny Hunter were all Test players who Huddersfield signed. And that meant that there was a wealth of talent from down under playing in the English game, and what the authorities decided to do was invite that other nationalities team to join the European Championship. So at the time, England, Wales and France would compete in what was a triangular tournament, but other nationalities were added to that competition in 1949, and that was an incredibly competitive competition at the time. So France were possibly the best team, best international team in the world at that point. Great Britain were a very strong team as well, and even split down into the component parts of England and Wales. Both teams were able to field extremely competitive outfits. So when you added in what was a mixed, typically Australian New Zealand team, but also included Scottish players and the like. So Dave Valentine, who was actually the Great Britain captain who lifted the World Cup in 1954, he played for other nationalities. So that was an incredibly strong team that Brian was a part of there. And they won that championship in the 1953 and 1956 seasons. And there's something of a mythical team, I think, looking back in time when you see some of the great names that played for them.
Yes, but I think even for other nationalities, he sort of holds the record there for the most tries for other nationalities. I read somewhere, I think he scored 26 tries for other nationalities, and that's by far the highest of anyone who represented that team. Do you think he had some regrets about never playing for Australia?
Yeah, I think inevitably he will have done. It was well known once I spoke about the transfer ban then and that being rescinded. It was open policy from the ARL that any player who was signing to move to an English club were deselecting themselves from being able to play for the Kangaroos and being able to tour. And I think, for any Australian at the time, and the international game was probably much more important in the eyes of the Australians then than it maybe is now, unfortunately, with the rise of Origin and maybe the demise of Britain. But certainly at the time, selection for a green and gold jumper and being able to tour England were probably the pinnacles of Australian players' careers. But Brian had given that up at a young age, I guess, to try and make his way in the English game, and then became settled in Warrington and had such success there. And the financial incentive to kind of stay in England and play for Warrington would have been too great for him to give that up with a young family and relocate back to Australia. So I think circumstances and economics meant that it was something that he had to forgo, but inevitably that would have been something that, whilst a logical decision, I guess the emotional part would no doubt have had an element of regret never to have played for Australia, because certainly when you see his performances and his record, he would have been able to cut it at that level, no doubt, as his other nationalities' performances proved, as you rightly pointed out. And
Neil, when Brian Bevan does eventually retire, there's all sorts of tributes to him. There's statues, walls are built. There's all sorts of tributes to Brian Bevan in retirement.
Yeah, there is. And some of that, I think, unfortunately, was a little bit late in coming. I think the sport of rugby league hasn't necessarily been the greatest at recognising its former players and giving them the credit that they deserve. That's something which has improved a lot, I think, recently. But certainly, by the 1980s, 1990s, when a lot of that heritage work is starting to gather momentum, you've got things like the Hall of Fame launched in England, and Brian's and one of the initial inductees into that in the UK. Upon his death, the Warrington Club renamed the main stand at the Witherspoon ground after him. There's a statue erected in his honour outside the ground as well, which has now been relocated to the new ground, which is great because it means that modern day fans get to see what's a fantastic statue and a fantastic likeness. So I guess a lot of your listeners might be quite separated by distance from England, but
Yes.
if anybody's over, maybe for the World Cup later on next year, I can do my pitch for the Warrington Tourism Board and say, make sure you get yourself down to the Halliwell Jones and see the statue, because it is brilliant. So yeah, there's a lot of recognition comes then, and I think that's only fitting given his achievements in the English game, that he's held up there at the very, very pinnacle of the sport in this country, and his achievements will long be remembered and will certainly go down in history, as they should do.
And Neil, in retirement, do you know what Brian did when he finally retired?
I think maybe alongside the regret, probably from never playing for Australia, I think what seemed to stick more with Brian, from people that we know have spoken to him after his career, is that he didn't really have any involvement in rugby league from the point that he played that final game for Blackpool. He made the very occasional appearance in some testimonial matches or sevens tournaments. But I think there was a lot of talk about how upset he was that it wasn't deemed, he wasn't deemed suitable for coaching positions and that sort of thing. So it never seemed to kind of line up, as it often doesn't for players, actually, given how few coaching positions there are in the sport. It never seemed to, the planets never seemed to align for him to land that kind of a role. So I think there was an element of regret from him that he never, the sport didn't deem worthy to give him the opportunity to pass that knowledge on.
Right.
So I think that's something that maybe caused an element of upset for him in his rugby retirement, at least.
He did have a coaching role back here in Australia. He coached Goondiwindi in 1968, only for a very short period. But at some stage, he obviously came back to Australia, and he was coach at Goondiwindi in the one of the country divisional competitions here for a while. So he did eventually get some sort of coaching position. And Neil, just before the final question, can you tell us a bit something about the Rugby League Record Keepers Club? Because, I understand that, it's got a bit of a history as well. It started back in the 1970s, did it?
It did, yeah. So a great guy called Irvin Saxton, who's still with us, and he's still a member of the modern day Record Keepers Club, actually. He did some fantastic work along with a number of statisticians and historians through the 70s, 80s and 90s. And the key elements of their work at the time were, as I mentioned before, defining the scope of games which were to be included in records, and establishing the basis on which all the records of the game in this country should be kept, and then set about gathering all the information relating to all of those games. So compiled full match details in terms of team lineups and try scorers and goal scorers for all of the games going back to the breakaway in 1895. And by the mid 1990s, they'd completed that work and completed that set of records. And with modern day records being kept on an annual basis, they wound their work up at that point. And then it was over the kind of off season of a couple of years ago, there was talk on social media from a number of people about how good it would be to get the Record Keepers Club reformed and try to bring things into the 21st century. A few of us got together and had a conversation around that, and I kind of took on a role of trying to coordinate with historians and statisticians from different clubs to see if we could get something together again. And then in April of 2020, so about 20 months ago now, we relaunched the club with the view to creating, basically sharing all the information that we already had and making that freely available to the public. So we have a website which is rugbyleaguerecords.com, and what we're looking to do on there is to share all of that information going right the way back to 1895 using the records that we've already got. They're handwritten records on paper originally, but we've been working hard to get those digitized and get them into a database.
Okay, yes. Yeah.
With a view to sharing that.
Yeah, sounds like a very big job, mate.
It's a huge task with over, you're talking 70,000 matches and 2 million points scored, I think is what we reckon there is. But the various lockdowns we've had in the UK have probably been a help for us in terms of giving people time and capacity to help with typing information in.
Yes.
So we're a long way on with our work at the moment, and we will, at a point probably in the next 6 months, be making the first batch of data available for everybody to view, which will cover all of the summer era records in the UK. So everything from 1996 will be available on the website for people to see. So anybody who's a current player, we will have kind of live records of their career, which will be up for everybody to see, which will be a great achievement when we get there.
And finally, Neil, Brian Bevin is Rugby League's highest ever try scorer with 796 tries. Will his record ever be broken?
I would never say never, but, and there's a very big but here, I think the circuit, it's very, very, very hard to see the circumstances in which it could be broken. You are starting to see in sport longer careers with advances in how players look after their recovery, and 18, 20-year careers even in rugby league and in other top class sports are not uncommon now. They're starting to be you're seeing in other sports. Soccer's got Ronaldo and Messi who've been at the top of the game for a decade. Tennis, you've got Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, you've got LeBron James, you've in basketball, you've got Tom Brady in American football. You're starting to see players stay at the very top of the game for a long period of time. However, even if you have a 40-year career, you've got to average a 20-year career, you've got to be averaging 40 tries a season to get to 800. And in the British game, we've only had a couple of players do that in the last 25 years, and only just do it then. So it's incredibly difficult to see the circumstances where a player is going to be good enough to stick around for that long at the top flight, and have the level of try scoring ability that we've seen from Brian. And there's a reason he's 200 and odd tries ahead of the next best person all time. So I guess the short answer is no, I don't think so.
That's the way it was. Rugby League's highest ever try scorer, Brian Bevin. My name's Rob Corra. On behalf of Neil Ormsted, this program was recorded in the studios of Undercover Music. Your producer is Adriano Aldemar. Until next time, may the force be with you.
All the stories have been told of kings in days of old, but there's no England now. All the wars that were won or lost somehow don't seem to matter very much anymore. All the lies we were told, all the lives of the people running round, their castles are burned. Our eyes see change, but inside we're the same as we ever were.